OC, feel free to uh start the recording. Okay, so we're being recorded now. All right. So, uh, with everything out of the way, I believe we can begin the round. So, debating on the motion about publicly traded companies, I'd like to call PM to begin the round.
Everyone see and hear me?
Yes, you're seen and heard.
Okay. Before I start, shout out to Kelvin who was sick and that's why I'm on this team. He lives near Pioneer Mall, so we hope he will be watching us. We think the current system functions in a way where the workers' rights are essentially violated and prostituted against. On our side of the house, we strongly believe that having union representation in the direct chain of command is the one and only mechanism workers are actually able to be properly heard, incredibly properly. Let's deal with a few points of setup before I move on to arguments. First, what does the board of directors do and who comprises this board of directors to begin with? We think this is comprised of CEOs, main shareholders that probably like go across like different companies and industries, given how these like MNCs of publicly traded companies tend to be extremely huge. But I think it's also the fact that it's publicly traded means that the public probably holds a substantial portion of these shares, like at least like 40%, for instance. They are the ones that are in charge of making decisions for the company, be it like on workers' rights or economic decisions. Let's characterize union representatives for a bit. The first thing, elected by other union members. So they probably do have a high status and influence amongst the workers. They probably have experiences working side by side. Second, we think that these union supposed to exist on our side. So they still do represent the union, but now that they have double roles, like one as being on the board of shareholders, but another as being a representative. I think lastly, we'll note that there probably will be multiple union representatives in one company, given that multiple unions can exist across like the industry or for the company itself. So this is especially the case for large conglomerates that have different functions over different industries. They probably have a certain critical mass within the board of directors itself. Let's move on to the argument then. Why do we better protect workers' rights? The premise now is that we think that the public wants these companies to make a lot of money, and thus this leads to companies oftentimes prioritizing profits at the expense of workers. This looks like cost-cutting measures such as layoffs or like and like going against workers' rights by forcing them to overwork or just not providing them safe conditions for them to like work in general. The problem now is that we think that current unions are incredibly insufficient and powerless. The first is that their main system is strikes, and we think that the most vulnerable workers don't do that in society because it removes their ability to earn money. You don't go to work, you probably lose your job in the long term, especially if like your resume or like you constantly go on strike, and this carries on to like when you want to find other jobs. Second, we think it's incredibly hard to coordinate large scale pushbacks against these companies because unions simply don't have the platforms to do so. This is especially the case for companies that operate like amongst like different countries. These union leaders don't always have the time or like the platform in order to communicate like coordinate large scale protests. But lastly, we think that unions oftentimes face declining membership due to hyper competition in the modern market. Thus, companies have incentives to push their workers to the limit and view these unions as a hindrance to profit maximizing. The outcome of this is that companies actively disincentivize against workers joining the unions to begin with, which lowers the critical mass that they have to enact change. What is the mechanism then of why we are able to enact change? We think that having union representatives in the board of directors is going to enshrine workers' rights. Let's first talk about how unions operate in the status quo, right? We think they have regularly scheduled meetings to discuss the concerns that workers are facing within the union itself. And because these union representatives have personal interactions with the workers, they know them better. But we think the problem is that
Sure.
at the point that unions want to like submit their complaints to the board of directors, it's incredibly difficult for them to do so because it requires a lot of time for you to the entire process of submitting the complaint, sending it up the chain of command, then discussing it and meeting with the union leaders. This oftentimes causes a lot of like, administrative lag. And the workers' rights are not like immediately addressed. But before I move on, POI.
Yeah, how do you think the selection process for union representatives look like, and how are these people?
Well, it probably looks like elections within the union representation itself. We don't think it's necessarily going to be like very privileged rich people because then the workers just wouldn't vote for them. So, okay, What does this then changes on their side of the house? The first thing to note is like even assuming that these unions have a decent critical mass to enact some accountability on government, why do we still win? I think the first thing to note is that workers are important parts of the company, and we think that they should be valued and represented as such. Because union representatives are proximate to their workers and are basically an extension of them, we think that this is the best way. The best way to represent their rights is just by putting them up in the chain of command. Second, we think we are better able to combat information failure on their side of the house. We don't necessarily think that the board of directors are always evil. Note that this is an incredibly charitable characterization, but it's just that they are high up the chain that is disconnected to the real needs of workers. So this means that they have very little ability to reach out to workers in, for example, a branch in Indonesia when the main headquarters is situated in Singapore. This problem is made worse when the managers lower down the chain of command have personal incentives to not report complaints precisely because it affects performance, and so it affects their ability to get promoted. We think that individuals on the ground are then so far away that they find it difficult to report their problems directly to their superiors, and the alternative of union worker unions is less effective because they have a lack of perceived legitimacy. How we fix this by having like real-time feedback, right? And this addresses how we overcome the current insufficient system. We think we have less time lag because the union rep is in the direct chain of command, so they can immediately bring up like these issues at these board of director meetings. And we think this is incredibly important because it takes time to resolve and implement new strategies and to keep up with the changing needs of these workers. Why then will the board of directors are likely to listen to these union representatives, right? Two reasons. The first is that we think they have an incentive to cater to them because a lot of decisions that are made within the board are made via voting. And we think that these votes can be quite close and contentious because shareholders may belong from different industries, and these different industries will be impacted differently by one company's decision. So we think that the existence of multiple union reps additionally also means that there's a formation of critical mass amongst the most influential individuals of the company. It probably means that on their side of the on our side of the house, the board of directors will have to pander to the union representatives in order to encourage them to vote in interest of them. And this likely looks like trying to get that on their side by giving some value to the opinions and suggestions that are brought up by the union representatives in the first place. But the second mechanism is on visibility, because we think that the problem in status quo is that the public doesn't like unions for these companies because they view them as hindrances to the company achieving the most profit motivated goals. We think that union representation in the board of directors elevates the status of union reps. So even if we don't change public perception, this accounts for the power asymmetry that has existed in the past by giving them like a place in the direct chain of command. But I think this is important because now when the public also depends on the opinions of the unions in order to forward their own interests, it means that when unions speak out about issues relating to the board of directors not listening and like enacting change within the workers union, the public necessarily has to value it. So even in the worst case that the board of direction doesn't listen, the inclusion of these individuals like and elevating their status necessarily means that we get additional accountability to protect workers' rights because the public is more likely to side with these union representatives. For those reasons, see you at 4 p.m.
All right. Thank you very much, PM, for the speech. Let's start off bench by calling on leader of op. Hello, it's leader of op. All right, no worries.
Hello. Hello.
Yeah, you're seen and heard.
Thank you. POS by chat, please. Thanks. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The fundamental key to growth and even survival for a company that is large enough to be publicly traded is efficiency and the public confidence that your key priority is to make money. At the point in which you muddy these interests in the foremost group of powerful individuals within the company, both the organization and her employers suffer the most. On setup, first, what are the current mechanisms for workers' welfare that exist in the status quo? This will largely mitigate the worst excesses of employees' harm that Gov wants to push on us. Couple of reasons. Firstly, auditing. The fact that you are publicly traded suggests that you have undergone an IPO. These are often severely rigorous tests and evaluations by government authorities surrounding things like workers' welfare and HR departments. The incentive for the government to do this is because the risk to the economy if you go under is quite large. Second, you have large amounts of public scrutiny at the point in which you're publicly traded, so that increases the incentive for things like personal regulation. You probably have year-on-year HR reports. Third, we still have unions on our side of the house with sufficient leverage against oppressive company practices. Response to LO at this point, this is nonsense because companies by law are not allowed to interfere in unions. But secondly, also, the big red button often still exists. The only leverage the company has over you is your job. At the point in which where this becomes a living hell in the worst instances, this leverage automatically disappears. I'm unclear why union people don't want to enter these unions in the first place. All of these three reasons create the self-preservation incentive for companies to also be transparent to workers. You likely have things like regional CEOs and BODs as well. But also, the problem that Gov pushes on us is likely a problem-solution mismatch. Maybe we can require companies to publish monthly reports. I'm unsure why we need to elect a literal new member of the BOD. Third, and lastly, even if exploitation was rampant, it is a problem-solution mismatch because common issues like which or day off things are things that are typically resolved by government intervention. Reduce tax for low-income workers, for instance, progressive wages are subsidized by the government. These are all independent mechanisms that don't affect the company but still benefit the workers. The second thing I want to explain in setup, but also response, is what the actual delta in this debate is. This requires us to actually examine what the BOD actually means. The first thing I want to point out is that this is the most crucial thing to recognize, that everyone on the BOD has immense amount of power, like firing the CEO, to make decisions surrounding things like share control, how much to dilute shares and share buybacks, and things like company management. But the second and most important thing to recognize in contention with their characterization is that these are a small group of individuals that oftentimes are individuals that have the largest stakes in the company. For example, they have large amounts of stocks that tie their personal wealth to the life of the company. Just because Hao Ming is a member of the public and has 100 shares of SIA does not mean that he is on the board of directors. So this is unclear. First argument, why do you hurt the company? I'm first going to explain why there's a fundamental conflict of interest when a union representative enters the BOD. First, there is a large personal incentive to advocate for workers' interests above all other considerations. Two reasons why. Firstly, because they have likely possess a large sense of responsibility to every other worker in the company. This also likely suggests that your position is at risk at the point in which your workers' interests are not met. Secondly, also, is that you also likely have far less stake in the company as well. You do not own that many shares, so the risk of loss is far lower if the company goes bust. Third, they themselves have less experience. They may have experience in their own area of specialization, but not so much in company management, so I do not think this is something a Gov can claim. For example, the intricacy of balances between company share portfolios, things like market evaluations into 5 years and 10 years down the line, these are things that you probably don't have access towards. The conclusion of this analysis is that union representatives themselves are likely to disagree with many of the BOD's decision-making processes. Why? Firstly, they inevitably have to sacrifice some degree of workers' rights. For instance, if a company wants to dilute their shares, this risks workers who may own some shares making less, but this is essential for the company's growth. Or things like taking on mergers and acquisitions, that means that some people need to get retrenched. Union representatives will hence be quite unwilling to acquiesce to a good majority of these particular but necessary policies, and the time taken for these decisions to be made inevitably increases. Why is this a major issue for publicly traded companies? First, many of these decisions are time sensitive in nature. Companies likely have a first mover advantage that they want to protect, to prioritize, but it's also secondly that shareholder confidence is fickle because confidence seeps away quickly at the first sign of indecision at literally the highest position of the company. Notice, moreover, that the union isn't a monolithic entity. It also needs time to aggregate the opinions of its workers that adds to the time wasted. But lastly also, that this is especially true when you are a large company who's publicly traded, which exacerbates the extent of public scrutiny that exists. But the second reason here is also that you're forced, at the point at which you're forced into compromise, company interests are harmed because the prioritization of the company's BOD is long-term development. Union representatives need to be short-termists because it is difficult to justify to your union that they need to get retrenched in the short term for long-term company expansion, which may benefit union employees in the very long term. There are a couple of impacts to this claim. I will first weigh this against government's metric of benefit to workers. So the first impact here is that it hurts workers directly because you lower the profits of companies that they're naturally able to make at the point in which they miss out on weeks and times of being able to create a decision that makes them profits as opposed to every other company. That means that lower profits necessitate the company to try and recuperate revenues. Things like, for example, mechanisms like mass entrenchment which are forced into doing at the point in which you cannot make as much money, also things like overtime demands and exploitation. Secondly, also, you harm investors directly because note the downstream impact of decreased investor confidence when they perceive that the BOD does not have a unified stance. They are far less likely to invest into your company, which further decreases your ability to have growth. That means that workers themselves are also harmed on a far larger degree of scale on their side of the house because the company suffers as a whole, which therefore implicates their ability, for example, to hire more workers to have more pay for them. Before I move on to my last impact, yeah.
By that logic, every time the board of directors disagree with each other, the company is screwed.
No, because most of the board of directors have large stakes in the company. They're likely to have aligned interests to want to benefit the company for long-term growth. Union representatives don't have large stakes. They are likely to have conflict of interest. I think this mechanism is quite clear. Third impact. That means, and most importantly, the BOD themselves have a principled right to this agency over the company because your own livelihood and the wealth you have is tied to this company because you have large stakes in it. It's something that they own themselves relative to other kinds of workers that have relatively low stakes. Because if you're a worker and the company goes under, you are able to transition to another company. You're able to find another job. But as a board of director, at the point in which the company goes under and it goes bankrupt, your wealth also diminishes to a very large degree. This is independently a reason why it is that we should have these board of directors in these places in the first place, because the power they possess is relative to the harm and the risk they incubate and they absorb at the point in which companies go under. That is to suggest that the responsibility aggregation to making good decisions for the company ought to rest to a very large extent on the board of directors as opposed to workers who have relatively low stakes in these kinds of companies. At this point in time, I think the idea of being able to support workers' rights is at the best a small benefit on government, but also that we trade this off massively because in the long term, they are the ones who harm workers. Very proud to oppose.
Great. Thank you very much, Leader Fob. Let's continue by calling on TPM, please.
Sorry, could you give me a second? Can everyone hear me?
You're heard right now. There was a bit of a static. Oh, there is a bit of a static right now, though. Could
Is
you
it?
say yes?
You can say this comment. You can say this comment. We can say this comment. He says it's very.
Is this okay?
It's okay with me personally, but there is static. I'm not sure if that's okay with everyone
Is
else.
it on? I could try doing the volume. We can put volume here and then. Oh wait, hold on.
Try the mic. Ask the
Wait. Okay. Is this okay?
Yeah, no, much better.
Oh, okay. I guess I will. Can take few. I think this is okay. Okay. So I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So at the point in which you have union representatives in the board of directors, then we say that is at the point in which you're able to bridge the connection between the workers and the elites at the board of directors. And for this, we're very happy to better worker welfare and to better company efficiency. There's 4 things I want to do. First, just rebuilding our case. Second, on the counterfactual, why unions are so slow. Then 2 extensions later. So on the first point on rebuilding our case, and I think despite Joshua's attempts to mitigate, workers' welfare is still going to be a very huge concern in the status quo because currently there exists a lot of stigma, a lot of preconceptions that companies need to squeeze their workers dry in order to even succeed in this hyper-competitive world, insofar as there's heavy amounts of globalization, which means that you're able to hire, for example, cheaper labor in countries that aren't as economically developed as you. That means you're able to pay them less for about the same level of skill that you're going to get. And this means that workers are going to likely be overworked and they wouldn't have a lot of ability to deal with this very well for all the reasons that Tingy told you. But the second thing on this that and it's the question of why union members need to be very specifically in the board of directors rather than just working with them. And I think it is probably because the board of directors themselves just experience the company very differently from the rest of the workers. They're probably elites that maybe climb their way up to the top of the hierarchy through maybe like a lot of white collar jobs, which means that they are very disconnected from the real needs of people on the ground. So just psychologically speaking, the experiences that they have just oftentimes don't match with the needs of the workers that these union representatives are therefore able to combat, specifically because these union representatives are usually also workers on the ground, so they know these needs extremely well. They have regular meetings that encourage the feedback throughout these unions as well. Then moving on to the counterfactual then, on why unions would without this mechanism would likely be slow. And this is taking the charitable middle ground where we concede maybe there's no overwhelming crackdown on these unions. It might be illegal, but why is it that unions on their counterfactual are still going to be largely inefficient? And I think the reason for this is just that unions are just not directly connected to the top of the hierarchy. So this means that they have to pass through the incredibly long chain of command in order to get their feedback up to these people, which means that the only real way they're able to maybe show any immediate dissent to the company is through huge displays, maybe strikes or like protests, which would be a negative optic, which would be bad optics for the unions in the eyes of the company, because now you see this entity as now you see the union as an entity that is actively working against you. And for all these reasons, I think that at the point in which you have representatives that are able to link this chain of command, then you have the unions to be able to operate better or more efficiently. I think this is very perfectly fine. Then moving on to the first extension on how workers oftentimes have good ideas on how the company can be run. This leads to better efficiency and better company performance. And note that this directly clashes with Josh's first argument on efficiency outside of workers' welfare. And I think the premise of this is how workers are just very personally connected with or personally involved in the running of a company insofar as they are the labor themselves. So this looks like how they physically interact with customers and so know the changing tastes and preferences of the people on the ground. This implies maybe good feedback that wouldn't really be vocalized absent of these unions, because it's just a lot of work for a company that maybe you don't really feel as if they really care about your needs.
Why?
Or it looks like how this might be lead to better ideas on how you run these companies more efficiently. You're able to use the machines better. You're able to organize labor in a way that doesn't, as it might do in many companies, be so time-consuming that these companies just might insist on, precisely because they don't have a full picture on how efficient things are, because they never discuss these concerns with people so personally. Then moving on to the mechanism on this argument, on how it is that you have union representatives that lead to better efficiency. And I think two things here. First, it's your ability to respond to real-time changes. Because I think that on their counterfactual, where you go through this long chain of command, you either have feedback that's passed through maybe managers and then their section heads and then people high up on the chain. This is a very long process that leads to massive amounts of profit loss in the long term. Or it might be that these the people at the top of the hierarchy conduct intensive data collection, which also require lots of time, but also require lots of resources in order to enact. But I think the second point here on why you're able to reconcile the differences between the interests of the union representatives and these companies' success. And I think it is because currently there exists a stigma that, again, to be efficient, you need to squeeze these workers dry and to deplete the very essence of who they are because they're so easily replaceable. But we think oftentimes this is just going to be untrue, right? Like how if you maybe have workers that are willing to work for your company, they will likely stay in the long term, they would likely develop better ideas, they would be more involved, so they would work better with their coworkers, for example, which also leads to just better company performance that then leads to efficiency. Which are the impacts here? Just the company then works better, and through this, you're able to reconcile the divide between the existing divide between unions and the company, so they won't break down. You have POIs?
Yeah, information asymmetry is not a delta because there are other mechanisms for your voice to be heard. You needed to defend why these people have the right to halt company processes.
Very sorry, the audio cut, so I will move on. Moving on to the second extension on the principle and of how, since it is the workers that make up the backbone of this company, they are the ones that ought to decide the direction the company takes. And I think it's just true that workers make up the backbone of the company. They're the ones that put in a lot of their labor in this. They study for many years in school in order to just put in their efforts towards this company. They spend a lot of time here. They spend a lot of time in their lives here, and they put in much of themselves to go to these companies. And so it is therefore that they ought to decide the direction the company takes, because we think they have an active stake in this company as well. And so absent of this, sort of accountability mechanism, then they're just unable to dictate to any degree the direction the company takes absent of this mechanism. For all this, we're very proud to propose.
Okay. Thank you very much, DPM, for the speech. Let's hear now from Diallo, please.
Hi, sorry, am I both visible and audible?
You are both, yes.
Cool. Just give me a sec. Set up power. Okay. There are 4 points in this speech. The first, why are workers going to be well taken care of? I want to know on capacity that all of Joshua's mechanisms were independent of strikes. Lauren cannot just not respond to this and simply assert that trade unions have no incentive to use these mechanisms to get their say in the world, especially if there are present mechanisms in that particular company. This was like one, the IPO existing as an independent mechanism to check in on worker welfare, meaning it doesn't reflect poorly on the trade union, but it's also things like the government, which want to take care of their workers because they are the civilians who will vote for them into parliament. But secondly, trade unions often have the capacity, absent of strikes, to relay oppressive practices to the media. All of these are independent of strikes. The second part of this is I want to explain why it's in the incentive of the company, even in profit, to do the workers well. There are 3 reasons for this. The first is that on capacity, there is communication between worker and management. Lower level hierarchies just exist. It looks like lower level bosses, regional headquarters. There's often an equal capacity for you to forward your needs and wants to these people. Being able to feedback is often incredibly possible. But secondly, I want to know it's not even the BOD that determines the individual worker needs. These are often lower level management, like your bosses, determining how much they pay you or how much they work you on, how many they work you on an everyday basis. These are decisions you don't even need to relate to the highest level of management. It's often the intermediary person. But next, I want to note if you can somehow forward your views to a singular trade union representative in the board of directors, that long distance between communication is often symmetric anyway. All of this means that communication exists on our side is incredibly possible. But secondly, I want to know that happy workers are fundamentally intertwined with profit. Why is this true? Because oftentimes in these companies, there's a high level of worker specialization. Your company often leverages worker specialization as a comparative advantage to do things like producing better products or to do it faster. These all means that companies often invest mass amounts of money into their employees through things like training, through things like teaching them particular skills that are integral and unique to their particular company. Why is this important? Because one, employees leaving often means that it's a waste of investment for that particular company. But secondly, employees could often leave to other competitive firms. Firms often compete for labor, especially if they're specialized. And being a bad employer often means you directly lose your productive capacity. 3, I want to know that publicly traded companies are very contingent on public confidence in them. Why is this the case? Because if any form of massive oppression that PM frames to us is revealed by a trade union, that means the public belief in the value of that stock plummets. Why is this important? 1, this devalues the stock that the board of directors holds, meaning they have a direct incentive to ensure that the public believes in the company. They have an incentive to ensure that workers are treated well. If not, they will speak out and your company will fall. But secondly, I want to note that any form of oppression forms instability in that company, and that deters investment, because when they think this company isn't treating their workers well and probably isn't going to get that much investment or that much belief in stocks, it also means that your value of your company decreases. Empirically, companies cannot risk PR scandals if they want to keep the stock trading high in value. Look at how Amazon's oppressive acts being revealed plummeted their stock and eroded massive profit. CF also Tesla. No company wants that. Critically, if you want to get profit, you have to treat your workers well. All of this means that companies have massive incentives to not just take care of their workers, they also have the incentive to leverage things like their HR departments or generally hand out bonuses to ensure that workers want to stay with them. This is directly tied with profit. Do not listen to their assertions. I want to highlight two independent win paths to victory, independent of union efficacy. The first is on firm efficiency. In any situation, there are conflicting opinions between the union representative and the board. Even just one vote in a small pool of directors is often significant by their mechanism and framing. This paralyzes decision-making because it massively slows us down. Why is this important? There are three reasons for this. The first is that these companies are often outcompeted in the long run by faster alternatives. Things like the first mover's advantage, being able to claim market share in nascent industries is often incredibly dependent on your speed. But secondly, investors often leave because there's a mass level of upper level instability. It often appears indecisive. What this means is the economy as a whole often slows down because people are less willing to invest if they believe that if they don't trust the upper level management. But secondly, on principle, I want to note that there's no commensurate level for people to have that much say in a company. Directors invest a massive amount of money. They sink massive amounts of millions of dollars into this company with the belief and with the trade-off, they're able to have some say over it. There is no commensurate capacity for workers. Workers all have the ability to just leave the company and join another one. Directors cannot because they invest massive amounts of money. If they leave, they get zero return on investment and even lose money. This also means that directors have an incentive to run it well. If they want a return on investment, it is not easily withdrawn from the shares. They often need long-term profit to generate any form of money from their billions of dollars that they invest. This doesn't just mean they have a right to invest. It oftentimes means that they want to do it efficiently. This means they often are going to listen to their workers and are going to make sure that everything is going to be done well so that the company is run well so that they get profits in the future. Before I go on, I'll take a POI.
Yeah, so the public has no information on how these workers are treated outside of outright exploitation.
So presumably IPO exists to audit them, but if it's a really big company because it's publicly traded, that probably means the trade union is commensurately pretty big. That probably means they're probably able to talk to the media. Could we just post it on social media people are being oppressed? If it can happen for Amazon and Apple and Tesla, it surely can happen for these companies, and those companies are pretty huge. Okay, lastly, I want to note very clearly why is it so that trade union representatives harm company efficiency. Very simply, their short-term incentive, as Joshua frames to you, is to ensure that workers are protected. What does that mean? That means that efficient practices by the companies often get slowed down. I want to note we are trading off workers being sacked somewhat. We're not accepting high levels of oppression. But these things are often critically necessary to ensure that the company is able to progress and to grow. It's often necessary for the company to be able to get the profits to continue developing and better the economy as a whole because they're able to provide cheaper products, for example, for consumers, or better able to drive economic growth to increase economic activity. Having a trade union representative, having a conflicting perspective fundamentally slows that down, but also means that these decisions often can't happen in the first place. So maybe you're able to protect workers, but notice how this also harms them in the long run. Because when the company fails because they don't get as much profit or because they aren't able to grow as much, it also means that everyone in the company gets retrenched. So even if you want to protect workers, they are often hard on your side insofar as the company goes bust. Lastly, extension. Why does this decrease director incentive to invest in companies? When you buy a share in a company to attain power, it is in the assumption you gain that reciprocal level of control. What is the problem here? Trade union representatives dilute that power. The board of directors is incredibly small. It's about 10 people. Every single person added means you dilute the level of control that the directors have. Even if this was a small percentage of decision-making power, the value of that power was often in the millions of dollars. Why is this important? Directors do not need to invest in a company, but that means that it decreases the incentive for them to purchase that mass volume of shares. That means that generally speaking, their firms get less investment. The economy just gets less investment from people because no one believes it's actually as worth it anymore to be in the board of directors. For all these reasons, oppose.
Great. Thank you very much, DLO, for the speech. Let's hear now from Gov Whip, please.
I can I check I'm audible and visible?
You are both, yes.
Can I check I'm audible and visible?
You are both, yes.
Hello? Okay. Okay, great.
All good.
I will. Yeah, I will start my speech in a moment. Give me time to set my recording. Yeah, PY by chat, please. Yeah, thank you. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. I would like to thank the previous speaker for not value adding the debate and repeating what his PM said. I will now respond to the 7 minutes of material they have and note how he didn't engage any of Lawrence's mechanisms at all. The first thing I want to talk about is why current mechanisms of enacting change for workers or getting better worker rights are going to be insufficient. Note here, they didn't respond to Tingy's claims about why unions right now are currently insufficient. I'm going to deal with that later on, but I'm going to assume that the only mechanism for getting workers' rights is the IPO mechanism. Here's a few problems. The first thing is that the IPO is inherently controlled by governments. So the broad assumption in that claim is that governments are going to have extremely good incentives to cater to these workers. And the reason they gave was because oftentimes workers are the ones that voted the government in. But not oftentimes, the political capture of politics that we see right now, instead of the rise of the far right, for example, the US, means oftentimes these political parties or these people in government oftentimes have closer ties to corporate incentives in the first place. So that is to say, they're more likely to allow you to get your IPO over and just kind of turn a blind eye to all of these things, because oftentimes you have close ties to them, and they were the ones that elected you into office in the first place by giving you political funding. But B, this also means that you get massive economic benefits in the short term and you look better as a worker. The deadlock breaker on the specific idea of incentives here is twofold. The first is that oftentimes devaluing workers' rights isn't something that's extremely visible. But secondly, you get more economic capital in the short term versus the idea of getting votership, which is incredibly speculative and also doesn't happen in the long term because you were already voted in, and whether you can get voted in again is incredibly speculative. The end outcome of all of this is you cannot make governments who are oftentimes corrupt and don't have the best incentives the sole protector and the arbiter of your rights. You oftentimes need to do this yourself and take this control into your own hands. Next, let's talk about, so this also means that the mechanism of unions now is oftentimes going to be the better mechanism on which you can enact change. There's a few reasons we told you why unions were insufficient in status quo. The first thing we told you was that unions don't have critical mass because companies oftentimes have the incentive to prevent people or disincentivize people from joining unions in the first place because they view these unions as diametrically opposed to the company incentives. Note how we break this deadlock and we uniquely change this on our side insofar as you elect union representatives into the upper echelons of the companies, in which they can then alter these incentives and make it so that it's okay for workers to join these unions, therefore increasing the power of unions right now. But next, also about the idea of legitimacy, because oftentimes unions had no legitimacy and they were not on equal speaking grounds with governments, and this power asymmetry then meant the absence of strikes or ongoing huge movements, they could do nothing to stand for their rights. Next, let's deal with Joshua's last mechanism of change, where he told you that workers can simply leave. I will note this is not possible for a few reasons. The first is that if you leave a company, oftentimes looks bad, which means that you're less likely to be employed in the next company. But next, let's challenge Deacon's characterization that the job market is one that's incredibly open. Because no, look at how many people are in the job market now. Look at how bad the job market now. Look at the global recession. The amount of jobs are incredibly limited. You can't just leave a job and find a new job. And even if you could, that's incredibly unfair to the majority of workers. But the third reason was because of immobility of labor, because this assumes that you live in an urbanized area. For many people that live in rural areas, oftentimes they only have that one good job. At the point in which you leave the company and the company blacklists you, you're then unable to find jobs other than moving to a very far away place, which a lot of people are unable to do so. The next thing I'll talk about is I want to do this insanely uncharitable characterization that companies are going to have the incentive to make their workers incredibly happy because this oftentimes leads to good outcomes. Look at instances like Amazon, for instance, where Jeff Bezos, who owns billions of dollars, literally owns the company, and he doesn't afford his factory workers any form of rights by making them work overtime, by giving them only 15 minutes for toilet breaks. The fact of the matter is that we know all of these things, but we are powerless to change them because we don't have the legislative ability to stand in the horsepower of these companies and change these companies' policies for the better. But next, I want to deal with that lack of response to why the mechanisms of change on our side get better. And note here, this is where I want to deal with the idea on their side and take them at their best, which is even if the board of directors in a company of the upper management have the incentive to make rights for workers better downstream, they don't know that the rights for workers are being oppressed because of the mechanism we told you they never responded to, which was the fact that oftentimes middle management, which is the people that the workers directly were able to interact with, did not have an incentive to tell this and relay this information to upper management because oftentimes they didn't want to look bad, because you as a middle management relaying information to the upper management that your workers are suffering seems to imply that you yourself are an incompetent leader, but it also means that you put more trouble on their plate, meaning to say that they would like to view in a less favorable manner. But lastly, it was on the idea of profit, because no, I can just counter assert that oftentimes making our workers work harder and giving them less breaks becomes more profitable, but the deadlock breaker here is this: people in middle management and people that craft company policies oftentimes don't have the incentive to just make the company more profitable and then give this profit to lower workers, because sometimes they want to capture more of their profits for themselves, so they don't have incentives to necessarily make the wages of workers on the lowest levels better. The unique mechanisms we gave you that broke this deadlock were to talk about how oftentimes we get more faster and direct change because you directly get change from the board of directors in the first place. So the top-down approach works better than the bottom-up approach. We also talk about mechanisms like visibility and legitimacy unresponded on their side. But next, let's deal with this insanely uncharitable characterization that because now your decisions take slightly longer, because now you want to account for more rights of workers, suddenly the company is going to collapse because everyone's going to lose faith in the company and it's going to be massive capital flood because everyone's going to remove money from the company. Note here that their mechanism is literally that these decisions take slightly longer to implement. No. So I want to just characterize how these companies actually function. Like, look, Deacon, you really like law, right? Have you ever watched Suits before? You know what the process of like getting acquisitions and mergers is an incredibly complicated process that takes a lot of discussion with these individual shareholders. But oftentimes, these individual shareholders themselves already have differing incentives because oftentimes they're incredibly complex decisions. But oftentimes they want to invest in different markets, for instance. So for example, if someone really likes China, for instance, they might invest in China more, another person might invest in US. These are the point in time in which shareholders have different incentives and they oftentimes come to a crossroad. So these problems already exist within companies, but companies don't collapse because of these problems because they're marginally slower. But next, I want to deal with the characterization. I want to deal with the fact is that these leaders of unions are incredibly stupid people and their workers are incredibly stupid. We say this is not true for a few reasons. The first is because union leaders oftentimes already interact with a lot of other companies to try to barter for better worker rights. This also then means that they probably have a good understanding of how these companies work because they're higher up within the echelons of society themselves. But next, oftentimes, at the point in which they join these board of directors, they're going to have access to information, like, for example, the different company statistics. And even if they did have access to information, we say them being there in the first place means that they're eventually going to have access to information and know the inner workings of these companies in the first place. This then also means that the kind of decisions they make are not going to be marked by the lack of capacity or lack of knowledge. So this then also boils down to the differing incentives between both of them. But I'm unsure as to why these differing incentives means that the company is going to collapse because these are in very rare instances. Majority of the time, if it's to do with things like for example, just purely spending money, we say that the company directors are going to do this themselves. To do with changing the rights of workers, we say that the union leaders are going to do this themselves. The charitable trade-off is that companies won't collapse. Maybe they get marginally slower. Not sure why rich investors getting slightly less rich is worse, but we say that we get far better rights of workers on our side. And let's deal with the trade-off here. We say that we get better welfare for the majority of workers and they become happier, co-opting their benefit of our companies becoming better. But we say this, sure, investors have invested millions of dollars into these companies, but we say most of the time they were rich people, these millions of dollars were the result of privilege. For the poorest workers on the ground, they have poured their heart, their soul, and their youth into the creation of these companies. Oftentimes, because earlier characterization that it's very hard for them to leave, these companies were the only investors that are fate, and we say we ought to give them control over this. Note how this co-opts their principle and beats them all funds. Very, very proud to stand at 4 p.m. at Pioneer Mall.
Great. Thank you very much, GovWeb, for the speech. Let's hear now from UpWeb. Opposition Web. Are you there?
Hi, before I begin, am I audible and visible?
You are both. Yes. There was a short static for a bit. I don't know if it's still there.
I will pray that it is not.
Oh, it's not static. It might be like a fan.
But I can still be heard, right?
You're heard, but there's definitely something like there is a noise that is a bit distracting.
Okay, it was because I was moving my feet. Okay, sorry. Okay, POIs by voice. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think it is very easy for you to just demonize a group of people who are richer and say that they're all evil capitalistic empires, that they are short-termist in nature, that people like Jeff Bezos are bad. But debating stretches far beyond just our initial instincts. As Declan already told you, the incentives of these people specifically cannot be to hurt workers. As he gave you the example of Amazon's exploitative practices being exposed by one single worker, leading to mass amounts of stocks plummeting and hurting these boards of directors. First, I will engage in the characterization debate. There are one answer that I'm going to give here before moving on to the second one later. The first question I want to answer is which actor is more myopic? What did we tell you? We told you that union representatives are likely to focus on short-term interests. The reason why this is the case is because the way they got into power through election is by focusing on the proximate interests of workers, which are often short-termists, like the monthly wage that you get, like the amount of working hours you're working on this month. And secondly, because they have no stakes in the company. So even if the company stakes go down, it is unlikely that they will be hurt because they still have to pay their their workers' minimum wage. This suggests to you that union representatives are short-termist in nature. In comparison, the board of directors needs to look into the long term. There are two reasons for this. First, because of the incentive for growth. The amount of money that they invested into these companies are not liquid. They stay as stocks. So that suggests to you that the only way they make back their money is through the company growing. The second is that they are already rich. The vast majority of directors only invest in companies because they want to diversify their portfolio. Having successful companies makes it so that their portfolios become more impressive and they get further opportunities down the line. This complex analysis suggests to you that the board of directors is less likely to be as short-termist as union representatives. The only response we got down the bench was them asserting that union representatives will focus more on worker rights, while the board of directors are likely to be evil. I don't think that is enough to prove that argument. Secondly, even if that is not true, why is the status quo enough? We told you that regulation is possible and often actually exists. Their assertion that unions have no power is problematic. And here is where Hao Ming's assumption that IPOs is our only mechanism is problematic. First, in response to IPOs, there are two here. First of all, I think it is politically independent due to third-party subsidiaries. Secondly, it is bound by public scrutiny on the stock market. It is not true that the government is the only actor controlling the IPO. And even if that is the case, I am unsure as to why regulation doesn't take place. But we also told you about a bunch of other things. The first thing that we told you is about auditing. Auditing by by law firms that are often private and independent often means that the HR and finances of these companies specifically need to be under credit. The second is that the unions still have the powers to strike, i.e. you frame out the worst case scenarios here. But even if that is not true, the solution to rampant exploitation cannot be the insertion of these people into the board of directors. Because if it is the case that you have the legal power to chain union representatives into the board of directors, we have the counter fiat to claim legal power to be able to enact some form of regulation on these companies. Maybe this means that we don't get the in-depth real benefit towards these workers, but the most basic grievances can be solved. Things like work disconnection policies and minimum wage can be implemented to help workers across the board. Gov sites agree with this when Lawrence says that the public only knows about the worst cases of exploitation, which feeds into our frame that the absolute worst cases will never actually exist, and even if they does, in the long run there is a self-correction mechanism. But thirdly, I want you to question if they actually do help workers in the first place. Intuitively, that is true. But note, down the line, the assumption was that putting them in the board of directors magically helps the workers, but you still have to fight the rest of the board of directors that still exist. The best that you get is very heated discussions and halted decision-making, which sometimes benefits the workers. But honestly, that causes the board of directors to grow increasingly hatred against the workers in the companies themselves. So I am unclear as to why you even help workers in the first place. And finally, they claim that we only get slightly halted decision-making. I swear to God, Hao Ming, for the last time, you cannot just magically mitigate arguments and say slightly benefit. We told you that the benefit is not slight. And here's where we make the trade-off, right? Even if the board of directors somehow doesn't care about the workers, the trade-off is likely to be large. Think about it. If they want to claim the biggest benefit of workers getting protected, it is either A, these union representatives takes up the majority of the board of directors, or secondly, they take up around half. Why is this important then? First, it leads to some form of halted decision-making. This occurs under the scenario where the board of directors are half split with the union representatives. But if they take up most of the board of directors, this is even more harmful. We told you mechanisms as to why it is likely that the board of directors is more capable in running companies. All they said is disconnected. However, there are comparative advantages. First of all, many of these people in the board of directors worked up the ladder. They know the company inside out, whereas union representatives are elected and they can be anyone. Second, their response to the time lag chain is to an insane extent. It is not true that regional worker rights need to be communicated all the way to the headquarters of the United States. Regional branches of CEOs and boards of directors do exist in different companies. Why is this important? Suggesting to you that the capacity of board of directors is larger in helping the company helps prove two things. First of all, the company is able to be far more dynamic. Big law firms that take on huge projects oftentimes cause temporary short-term harms to worker welfare for a large profit by finishing those projects. You can never engage with that if the priority of union representatives is to allow for the most continuous welfare of the workers. Secondly, there is huge time lag in decision-making because union representatives cannot unilaterally make decisions. They need to gain the opinions of workers, which suggests to you that decision-making at best needs to be halted because you need to wait. What is the implication of this argument? First of all, you lose the first mover first-mover advantage that's needed for you to gain an edge as a company. Secondly, you appear indecisive because you don't make big company decisions. And thirdly, you get stuck in stasis. Note how their arguments that workers do this better actually proves our point. Because if it is true that small issues such as the way in which you organize labor need to be passed up to the board of directors when they're supposed to be focusing on the big picture things like how the company move forward, that also suggests to you that the board of directors decision making will be severely halted because they are spread too thin. And I honestly don't know why that is a good thing, because oftentimes you can deliver these issues to middle management. Why is this a bad thing then? We suggest to you that the trade-off is not slight, because they either have significant holding in the board of directors or at least half. This suggests to you that companies are going to be immensely harmed. Why is this bad? Firstly, this harm workers, which win them on their metric, because if it is the case that the companies get harmed to a significant degree, like even 10 to 20%, this is where the worst harms get activated, such as mass retrenchment, because you need to cut costs in order for your company to stay afloat. But secondly, our comparative is when you get trickled down, because as the company grows, there's more incentive to pay your workers well in order to attract top talent, right? Note here that the largest impact also stretches beyond the company itself. Often this means that large amounts of economic hubs get put out because many investors from many industries invest into these countries. Oftentimes this means that companies like Enron falling, for instance, not only causes thousands of workers to lose their jobs, but also causes some form of economic contagion. The final thing that we brought to you that they never engaged with was on the principle. The stake of the board of directors is big because A, they took the risk. Directors cannot leave. Their wealth are not liquid and tied to company stocks. And secondly, they spend years of their life stuck in boardroom developing the company. Random people who decide that they are more important, joining the board of directors, deciding that their responsibility is going to be for the company, is not fair for these people who have the largest stake. Why is this recorded? For all these reasons, this is my territory. 4 a.m. Pioneer Mall.
Okay. Thank you very much, Opposition Whip, for the speech. Let's conclude now by hearing from Opposition Reply, please.
Hello. Can I share on both audible and visible?
Yes, audible and visible.
Thanks. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. In the hallowed halls of Pioneer Mall, the Black Spider Gang, referring to Prom, and the Black Scorpion Gang, referring to us, battled it out. There are two independent reasons why we came out on top. First, we had the more unique harm in this debate. They explained that there was a crisis of information asymmetry through the company structure, but I'm not sure why this was an independent win condition. They explained that there were separate mechanisms that you could access without putting you in a position where you could make important decisions for the company. There were many reasons. For example, you had public platforms where they could hear you out, even if it was the case that it was separate from the BOD. You had things like regionalization on a regional level. Things, for example, people like independent CEOs, independent board of directors on a localized level that could hear you out as well. Third, it was aligned with the profit-making incentives, because if it was really the case that you had good ideas, the company and the BOD would likely hear you out as well, because it expanded and created benefits for the company. Fourth, also, you still had the big red button, and this responds to the idea of union power. I think it's important at this point to recognize that the vast majority of their case likely is still unresponsive to the idea that unions still exist. Even if they were slightly weaker, they still have some degree of leverage against the company. But lastly, also, that on top of all the other independent checking mechanisms that we brought to you, things like, for example, the IPO, the fact that these people were subject to large amounts of public scrutiny on the public platforms. All of this suggested that the information asymmetry that they wanted to bring about wasn't actually mutually exclusive, if not quite marginal. But the second thing we also explained to you that you had to shoulder a significant harm as well, because we characterized from first that the BOD was crucial in terms of things like first mover advantage in a company or in a corporate structure that was incredibly competitive, especially in circumstances where you engage in things, for example, mergers and acquisitions. And secondly, also, this was important shareholder confidence, because at the point in which you had undergone an IPO and you had become a publicly listed company, this was crucially important that the public scrutiny that you shouldered as the BOD was one that translated into the idea that you were an efficient entity. Comparatively, you as union representative would always likely disagree. Why? We gave you many reasons as well. For example, you had a job to protect as a union representative. You wanted to maintain an image of loyalty to your workers. Or secondly, this translated into the idea of things like short-termism and inexperience with the corporate structures, because even if you had a good degree of specialization, you likely were not familiar with the big ways in which these companies worked. This meant that an individual with what we explained had large amount of power would halt decision-making, giving us access to our harms. You hurt employees in the long term at the point in which your stocks plummet, at the point in which these individuals are no longer able to make decisions efficiently. This was an independent harm that we brought to you. They never actually traded off at the end of this debate. The second way in which we win this debate is because we took the trade-off. Because even if it's the case that their harm existed, that workers' rights were harmed in the short term, we rate this on two levels. First, it was the scale of potential harm to workers. Because at the point in which investment decreases, at the point in which a company decreases in its wealth and its ability to attract investors, its ability to have efficient processes, these translated into harms to workers as well, because workers will rely on the companies for things like wages, to keep their jobs, for instance. At the point at which the company structure was crippled, this translated into long-term harms for the workers. But secondly, also, we explained why our world was more justified than their world, because workers themselves had comparatively less stake in the company. We explained why if you wanted to have more stake in the company, or if you wanted to have a more say in the company, you required a stake in order to influence the power that you had within these corporate structures. That meant that the board of directors, because of the fact that they had to shoulder the largest amount of risk, because of the fact that they were the ones that were going to go under the point at which the company failed, it meant that these workers did not have a right to be in the seat of the BOD at all. So this necessarily meant at the end of the day, we were able to co-opt the larger harm in this debate. But secondly, even if there was a marginal shift in the rights of workers, we still won this debate.
Okay. Thank you very much, Op Reply, for the speech. Let's conclude the round now by calling Gov Reply, please.
Oh, wait, what? Okay. Hi, can everybody hear me? Sorry, please ignore my team name.
Yes, you are heard and seen.
Wait, sorry. Can I be heard?
Seen and heard, yes.
Thank you. I think we've had a lot of fun challenging the Black Spider gang already, but we think that the biggest battle is probably going to happen at 4 p.m. That's why you should vote for Gov. I want to deal with the two premises that both cases hinge on. On opposition, the entire case hinges on the fact that long decision making causes time lag in decision making, and thus it will lead to an economic crash. I will prove why this in an incredibly uncharitable argument down the bench, and I'll weigh this out against their only refutation towards our case, which was that we never specified how many individuals were going to be on the board of directors, like how many union representatives were going to be on the board of directors in the first place. The first response to this is that we don't think this is a reasonable challenge, because obviously, it's not going to be a vast majority of instances that take up spaces on the board of directors. At that point, it wouldn't be representative of the number of shareholders that actually stake a claim in the company. But I think second, to flip this argument on them, I think secondly, the only ever refutation to our case was that they said that workers' rights were already helped now, so it is mitigatory at best, but they never actually took down our claim about how we better help workers on our side. So we can reasonably buy at the end of the debate is that we probably have a certain benefit of workers getting help on our side of the house. Let's weigh this up against their claim about an economic crash or all these companies losing a lot of money, right? The claim here is that at the point that that there is a conflict of interest between the short-termist union representatives and the long-term board of directors, then they will make very slow decisions and the company will not be able to progress. The first thing to note is that this is probably symmetric for every single company that exists on their side of the house, because this is a policy that is implemented for every single publicly traded company. So if there is a time lag on their side of the house, we'll point out that it probably exists for every other company. You probably don't have an economic crash. But second, even irrespective of this response, we think from what we have already pointed out to you that this argument is fundamentally flawed at the point that it depends on long decision making being the tipping point for economic crisis, right? Hao-Ming already points out to you that companies already do take a lot of time to make decisions. They don't just happen overnight with a snap on the finger. But second, it's also an extremely uncharitable characterization to say that every single board of director will always agree with each other because they always have the same incentives. Just because you have the same goal doesn't mean you agree on the way in which to meet that goal. So we don't think it's necessarily true that they have very quick, efficient decision-making processes on their side either. What you can then buy is that their only argument on creating an economic crisis is incredibly difficult to believe in, simply because if that was already true, then we think that every company in the status quo would be failing right now. But obviously that is not the case. So it means that the worst harm of their case was already subverted by our side of the house. But look, irrespective of all these outcomes, let's say an economic crisis does happen and these companies fall. Why do we still need to prioritize workers even if it's in the short term, right? And we think that Hao-Ming already weighed this up to you in terms of vulnerability, that these workers in the short term have absolutely no avenues to access better rights for themselves because of the structure of unions in the status quo and because middle management has incentives to not bring these workers up. The fact that we can improve the decision-making process whereby workers' rights get taken into account in the first place already means a gigantic leap in terms of what workers are able to achieve access in terms of their rights. Meanwhile, their harm of economic crises is extremely uncertain, and even if it does happen, it probably only happens to one company and only that group of workers is impacted. On our side of the house, we positively set a good precedent for listening to workers and prevent the prostitution of their rights. For those reasons, incredibly proud to be on Gov.